Good morning. You know, I have the pleasure of traveling all over the world, and when you travel, you often feel, that you're visiting places. I say this sincerely to you, but in just 24 hours here, the people I've met here make you feel at home. And I learned why that is, and that is because I'm actually Calgarian. And it turns out that Phoenix and Calgary have a sister city relationship, so I do feel like I'm here amongst family. How many of you have heard the Chinese proverb, "May you live in interesting times"? How many of you realize that it's actually meant as a curse? It's not something you aspire to. You actually want to live in the most boring times that one can. And yet, here we are in 2024, in an era of polycrises, in an era of mass transitions. You think about the geopolitical realities that we're all living in. You think about the economic situation, not just here, but around the world. Obviously, the outbreak of not one war, but two. You think about the transitions that are taking place in climate, in technology, including in our politics. One of the things that surprises people is when I get asked, what do your members? I represent about 175 of Canada's leading CEOs. They're half the Toronto Stock Exchange and employ millions of people and are obviously situated, as the mayor referenced, not just here in Phoenix, but around the world. What's on their minds? What's keeping them at night? Now, I could give you the business answer and tell you, sure, it's about talent or it's about cybersecurity or the economy and so forth. But it might surprise you that I speak with CEOs, not just in Canada and the United States, but around the world. Many are quite concerned about the state of democracy. They're extremely troubled on the attack that democracies are experiencing on the pillars of the institutions that hold democracy up, that make us democracies, that make us a different form of government, what we believe is a better form of government for people. But if we live in a society that attacks the things that are holding it up, it starts to wobble. And we're quite concerned because the reality is, when you live in a place that attacks the institutions, that no longer believes facts are facts, that you can have your own version of what the facts are, it creates an unpredictable, unstable environment for capital to form. And if there's one thing you need to all remember about capital, it actually does not have an ideology. Its sole purpose is to go wherever it's welcome, where $1 can become $2. Almost anywhere in the world, capital will form. Sure, there may be some exceptions. We might not go to Russia or North Korea, but they're pretty much everywhere else in the world, capital will find a way to form and to be deployed. It's in that backdrop that we're hosting this panel this morning called Navigating Global Trade in a Shifting Landscape. It's a pleasure for me to be hosting this panel because I'm coming at this from the perspective of, despite all what I've just said, the challenges and the realities and somewhat the doom of where we are, you must grasp hope from that somehow. And if you can't do that here in North America with three strong, vibrant democracies, albeit challenged as they may be in their own ways, we are nonetheless democracies, and which means the people have a say. And we need to do a better job to ensure that as a continent, we seize the opportunities that are being made available to us. If you look around the world, what do people look for? They want food. They want fuel. They want fertilizers. They want critical minerals. They want labor. And they want capital. Everything I've just mentioned is in North America. We have the opportunity to seize this moment to really build that critical supply chain. I don't like the phrases friendshoring and nearshoring, to be honest, because sometimes it becomes code for protectionism. We need to compete. We need to be free traders. We need to be multilateral. But we need to get it right at home first. We have to stop behaving in North America as three different countries and start thinking of ourselves as Team North America. So how do we do that? How do we do that in North America, and how do we turn it around so that we can demonstrate that what one can do locally, one can export globally, and that's the best hope I can think of to turn this situation around, not just for us, but more importantly, for the generations to follow, because we are the first generation to not situate life better for the generation after us. It doesn't have to be that way. We can do something about it, and we're going to start talking about it on the panel this morning. You've heard the names of the panelists. Please join me in welcoming Brian Tobin, Vice Chair of BMO Financial, Emilio Cadena, CEO of Prodensa, and Dr. William Maloney, Chief Economist for Latin America's Caribbean region of the World Bank. I look forward to discussion. All right, so we've got a great panel here, different perspectives on various things. I thought I would just kick off with reaction to what I've said, how it affects what you do, whether you agree or disagree with what I've said. So William, why don't I start with you?
So first of all, thanks very much for the invitation. I think the way you put it in terms of the opportunities that nearshoring or friendshoring offer, particularly to the region and to trade between the advanced countries in Latin America is absolutely correct. Janet Yellen said, huge opportunity for Latin America. I agree. I have to flag immediately that Emilio and I have some differences on data about what's actually been happening so far. If you look at the big aggregate data, we don't see huge increases in investment flows to Latin America or even to Mexico. There was a big jump in 2022, but in real terms, we're below 2010. Announcements of greenfield investments are also not going through the roof. Emilio will tell you why that's wrong. But just to put on the table, either it's too early or the data are mismeasuring it or it's not happening. Whatever, I'm looking forward. I want to believe Emilio. But let me just put 5 things on the table, which I think are challenges to making this happen on the Latin American side. The first thing is that we have to maintain the macroeconomic stability that's been achieved over the last 30 years. This is not your grandparents' hyperinflationary volatile region. We didn't do worse during COVID than any other region. Inflation right now, if you leave out Argentina and Venezuela, are below the OECD levels. So macro management is professional and good. We just have to hold on to that, and we could discuss why that's more difficult than we may think. Second, the region is unhappy. There's a lot of dissatisfaction. Even in Chile 5 years ago, we started having major protests in the streets, and that comes from a lot of different things, but a lot of it comes from the fact that we're growing at somewhere around 2.5%. And that's not meeting people's aspirations. And that's not a COVID residual. That was also in 2010. We were growing at 2.2 when the rest of the world was growing 3.1. That's leading people to question the model, which has been kind of the World Bank, if you will, Washington consensus model, neoliberal model, whatever you want to call it, a free market model, and is coming under question strongly in many parts of the region. We have to think about what's not working, and I want to point to 2 things that are not working particularly well. One is the level of human capital. If you look at just the scores that our kids in Latin America get on standardized tests at a secondary level, we are substantially below Asia. Asia's PISA scores, is one measure of quality, are about 500. Ours are about 400. Vietnam's is somewhere around 486 or something like that. So keep in mind, we got 400. Vietnam's got 486 in terms of just raw school quality measures. That's not a selling point for us. And when you've got 29% of Latin American entrepreneurs saying that growth is inhibited by a lack of trained labor, that's a major signal that we need to work on basic education, training programs. We do not have the kinds of schools that produce technical people at a mid-level. We don't produce enough engineers, and our academic institutions are not closely enough linked to the private sector. The last thing I want to just, infrastructure, we underinvest, okay? Mexico is great in some ways. Our ports are not there. That's true throughout the region. We have a lot to do, and we invest about half of what Asia or Africa even does. And the last thing I just want to point to is crime. What happened in the assassination of the presidential candidate in Ecuador is, I think, the tip of a pretty deep iceberg. We're seeing organized crime expanding into areas it wasn't previously, Chile, Uruguay, and it's just wreaking havoc throughout the region. If you look at homicide rates, we're about 10 times what the level is in Asia, and rising. That's also a barrier to making all this happen. So those are all big challenges. There are more that we have to work on if we're really going to get a greater integration and a greater exploitation of the friendshoring opportunities.
Super. Thanks so much, Bill, for that. A lot of ground to cover there. Emilio.
Yeah, I think first to your comments, I think I'm a manufacturing guy, so I'll speak from that point of view. First, we have in the center for me the consumer, a consumer that has been developing over the years, and now with technology, what we all want is products delivered immediately. Now, even if the delivery is not the day after, we believe that that's too late. So I think we're moving into the era of Rappi, but instead of tacos, we want a car, right? I want to order it now and I want it immediately. So we're having to do this as manufacturers in this political environment. We already show the world and the consumer that you can buy anything you can think of from anywhere in the world. And now the government comes and says, wait a minute, I think we have to have a different structure on trade policy, moving into protectionism, which in some cases I think is something that we have to do. I do believe that the world overall needs to manage better the dependency on China. And I think that just makes sense, right, for different reasons. But to your point, I think the only way North America can do it is if Mexico, Canada, and the US work together. And this is not like a romantic approach. I believe that that's the only way we have the natural resources, the capital, the demographics, and the talent willing and able to work in manufacturing, and the technology. Because that's the other ingredient that we don't know where we're going to be in the next 10 years. I think the technological transformation of the world, especially AI, I think that's the only word I hear more than nearshoring is AI. And very few people can explain what it looks like in 10 years. And I think that's the challenge we're in. So we are in an extremely interesting point of, at least I've been doing this for 30 years. And we've been talking about globalization and free trade. And that seems not to be the case anymore. Mm-hmm. So I'm like you, I'm guilty of being a free trader. And I think we have to be smart on how we decouple from China. And I think that's where we are missing it, because we believe that only by trade policy and putting tariffs, and Mexico just put tariffs on another 500 things that we bring in from China, without looking at the possibility if we make these things actually in North America. So the only thing we're doing is we're putting trade policy to increase inflation in North America. And I think that's where the governments are getting it wrong, from Canada, from the US, and from Mexico, the three of them. And but at the end of the day, I think this is an extremely exciting moment from the Mexican point of view. I think that those of us that are in manufacturing are living, certainly for me, the best era in 30 years. In 3 years, we have doubled the size of our business, which is very few industries in Mexico can say that that's the case. I think from the Mexican point of view, to close, is that the problem is that politicians say nearshoring is the vaccine for all the problems that we have in Mexico, and it's not the case. I think averages are evil. So when you look at the whole growth of Mexico, the average is very mediocre.
2.4.
But when you start looking into specific sectors, if you look at those that are industrial park developments that are not double the size today, is because they're not doing something right. So I'll close with that, and we can talk a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Emilio. A couple of things I'm going to come back to in your comments on the consumer and also on China. So thank you for raising those. Brian.
Yeah, no, this has been a very interesting start. I'm glad we all agree on every fact to begin with. So I'm for the last 12 years have been with the Bank of Montreal as an executive there, but I started as a young man at 25 in the Parliament of Canada, and I remember very well pre-global free trade days, and I remember very well when we tried to manage our economies with our elbows up everywhere and all the time. So it's interesting that Nicholas reminded us when he spoke in his opening remarks that the IEFA has been around for 30 years. It's been 30 years since the WTO was founded. And there can be no question that both the formation of the WTO, the provision of proper trade rules, always challenged, of course, and the advent of the free trade arrangements between Canada, the United States, and Mexico has, in my mind, been clearly a positive. There may be those who challenge whether everybody's benefited equally, whether everybody's been brought along, but net, it has been an absolute positive for sure. So with the lens of a banker, just came back a few days ago from China, spending a week in China, But somebody who spent 22 years in political life a long time ago, started at the age of 25 and got out at the old age of 47. I see the world today at a very important inflection point because, you know, Emilio, you made reference to it. Bill, I think you did indirectly as well. We have a lot of stresses on the system, and you talked about it in your opening remarks. Russia, Ukraine, and the world responds as it needed to and should have with sanctions, heavy sanctions against Russia, disruptive to trade patterns. We have a circumstance in Israel today that is causing great dislocation, great conflict in the Middle East, but more importantly, putting the Suez Canal, 12% of world trade flows to the U.S. Canal, putting that into question or at risk. So when you look at the USMCA, I say, God bless the USMCA. 500 million people that are living within a prescribed set of rules as to how we trade and live and prosper together within this region. That's against the backdrop of the Brits, inexplicably to me, I never understood it, and Brexit, and a lot of increased trade tensions showing up around the world, and politicians, and I used to be one, so I understand the instinct, especially in election years, wanting to solve problems by saying, we're just going to shut the door. We're going to kick the other guy out. To me, as we sit here thinking about nearshoring, supposed to be part of our subject matter, thinking about the North American package, we are in a privileged position. And it's important that we recognize it, we not forget it, we preserve it. Doesn't mean there isn't room for adjustment, but it works. And by the way, Emilio, from my perspective, when I look at Mexico in particular, the manufacturing sector and the auto sector in particular, Mexico is now one of the largest auto manufacturers in the world. It's not a regional player anymore. It's not a small player anymore. And it does so with parts produced in the United States and parts to a lesser extent produced out of Canada. And it is a huge success story. And that's the kind of regional collaboration that makes sense and is a win for all of us. And I say, let's begin this discussion by making up our minds that we're going to turn our backs on, or ears off to the voices of division, and we're going to preserve something that's been a win for all of us, the trade arrangements we've made.
All right, let me pick up on the fact that you've just been to China. Emilio mentioned China, so let's deal with that right off the top here. The phrase devolution was used, although the president has said not only is the world at an inflection point, President Biden, he has said at APEC most recently that the United States of America is not devolving from China. It is diversifying and it's de-risking. And this connects to the consumer point. We're heavily reliant on wanting the best things at the cheapest price. And so we're in conflict with that. You've just come back from China. How does this play out?
Yeah, that's quite a
that's the whole panel for the next hour.
Yeah, that's right. We've spent a lot of time on that one.
But isn't it the central question?
It is the central question. You know, look, first of all, let me say that my view is, of course, there are strong reasons to have differences with China in a whole variety of areas. We won't get into the list of them here today, including trade questions. But the notion that the rest of the planet is going to dictate a new world order to China, and that China is going to comply quickly and easily, is an attractive notion, but it isn't a correct one. China has significant challenges right now it has to deal with. I would just spend time in Guangzhou and Shenzhen, and the real estate challenge in China today is profound. Not only because of the Evergrandes and the Country Gardens and the regional banks and the local governments that lent into a lot of these projects. So local governments are also stressed and at risk, but because an emerging Chinese middle class invested in a lot of these developments and their capital is at risk. There's a reason the Chinese are the greatest savers in the world. They have to be. There is no social safety net like Social Security here in the U.S. or other programs in Canada or else, or for that matter, in Mexico that are going to come and rescue them. They've got to rescue themselves. And today, there are a great many Chinese citizens who find themselves in tremendous difficulty. The government of China still hasn't figured out, I don't think, how it's going to manage that crisis, how it's going to intervene. But let me just say, there's a big, huge problem working its way through the pipeline of Chinese public policy. China's not going away. China is a big player in the global economy. It will eventually be the biggest player in the global economy. That's momentum. It's going to happen. We need to refine the relationship, but talking to China culturally through a megaphone is a mistake. It's not likely to get much engagement in response. So I just close my comments on China by saying, in our bank, we have a fully licensed, under the Chinese regulator, bank in China. We have 400 people there. I happen to be the supervisor of that bank and board. We spend a lot of time in China. We're playing the long game in China. We have views too about how business is done. We try to influence how we are received and how we operate. But we believe in the long run, the world needs to stay engaged. You can't tell China, don't talk to Russia. And you can't tell China, don't provide assistance to Russia if you're talking to China through a megaphone. I'm encouraged to see Mr. Blinken has been to China, Madam Yellen has been to China. The U.S. is re-engaging. On the one hand, the rhetoric says we're being tough. On the other hand, there have been a series of high-level ministerial meetings that recognize these two countries have to talk and have to engage, and these two economies will not be able to dissolve their trade relationship, nor should they.
That's a great point. Don't just pay attention to what's being said. Watch what's being done. Adds Secretary Tai, Secretary Raimondo also. Never mind the fact that two presidents have spoken. So well captured there, Brian. Now, Emilio, you're the one who mentioned China in your remarks, and China seems to be in Mexico now. Mexico's recently has put out, I think, over 500 tariff announcements and stuff. Is that targeted at China?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's targeted in a lot of cases because of pressure of the U.S. I think this is the most important thing that we need to realize. But my concern is that from the political point of view, Mexico, the U.S., less Canada probably, but they're part of this team, if I may put it like that. We're spending a lot of time telling China what they can't do, instead of us getting together and say, what do we need to do to be a little bit more like China? And I want to be specific, so I'm not politically incorrect. Because the problem
Go ahead and be politically incorrect. Yeah. Go for it.
No. The problem we have is that the long-term vision of Asia overall, and they have democracies, but certainly China, is much better than the long-term vision of North America. And the problem is also that, again, when you look at manufacturing, China developed all the supply chain inside China. This does not happen in North America. So we need to figure out in 3 democracies, hopefully, that we continue to have, where we have a substantial election every 2 years, how do we actually build architectural infrastructure, institutional infrastructure, so we can have an integration, at least on the manufacturing side. I think technology should be there too. I think environment should be there too. I think it's crazy to believe that pollution stops at the border with a visa or not. I mean, this is the same aquifers, this is the same air we breathe. And I think that's the biggest challenge, Goldy, in my opinion, is how do we first decide that we are a region, because I don't think we are. I think there is, and we have all these panels and we all agree in the panel. I think that's part of the problem. There is a lot of, we're preaching to the choir here on what we need to do. But it's how do we actually have these 500 people agree on institutional architecture that can have at least a midterm plan on what we need to do to have a better integration? Because I don't think every time we go to DC, we say this, we are the most competitive region in the world. I think we should stop saying it, because I don't think we are the most competitive region in the world. We don't have the best infrastructure. We don't study the same number of hours. We don't get the same support from governments. So I think we should have a plan to really become the most efficient and most competitive region in the world without telling China, stop, don't go that fast, instead of us, putting ourselves together and step on the pedal.
So, Bill, let me pick up on the same China theme with you and say, what's going on in the Americas when it comes to China and their presence?
So I'm going to wave my hand about data again. mean, the first thing to realize is that with the exception of Mexico, China is now Latin America's principal trade partner. And that's a lot. It's a lot in commodities. So that tells you the nature of the transaction, but that's important. If you look at foreign direct investment using the same numbers, which Emilio will tell you are incorrect, they're about 9% of total FDI to the region, maybe 8% of greenfield investment over the last couple years, and that's up double from the previous 2 decades. So that's rising, but I think that understates the influence. If you look at signals of what their anticipation of where they're going to be in 10, 20 years, which I think we don't think about enough as the United States, major investments in ports throughout the region. So, for instance, Chancay in Peru, major port, 100% owned by COSCO, and it's a very controversial thing, but it's like major Chinese investment. You see in Mexico, four ports in Mexico have port projects financed by the Chinese, and also in Tierra del Fuego, access to Antarctica. That's clearly giving you a feeling for the long game that they're playing. And then they have a lot of other interactions with governments. Again, in Ecuador, a lot of support during fiscal difficult times over the last 10 years. That's not forgotten. And at the same time, I would say there is a little bit of an attitude of, look, we're Western in Latin America. We're Western, we're same time zone, same culture, basically. But these guys, you guys give us lectures on what we should be doing. And the Chinese actually bring toys. So I think that we have to pay a little bit more of attention to these different ways in which the Chinese are playing the long game. That's investment for Latin America. That's my region. Those are my clients. And think about if we want to be the attractive competitors in the region, let's say the North America, then what's the package going to be? And we're known to be very good in technology. We know how to get things done. Then, again, I'm speaking as this block.
Okay, I want to move on to another topic, but before I do, Brian has a quick word on China to wrap it up.
No, I'm going to pass and let you move on to
Okay, let's do the other topic then, because it may come back. The other topic is this notion of, we hear it a lot now, economic security is national security, and inherent within economic security is energy security or food security or so forth. We talked about friendshoring, nearshoring, and as I was saying earlier, the consumer probably doesn't care where the glass was made or where their pen was made or where their phone was made. But we do need to be concerned about the security aspects around things like critical minerals and how we manage that when it comes to other countries, not just China, just other countries itself. So Emilio, I'm going to start with you. When you think of this transition underway, what is Mexico's role when it comes to energy and critical minerals?
I think on energy, Mexico is an alternative for alternative energies, actually. That's it. I don't think Mexico, although we have some critical minerals, we cannot be the solution to that for North America. And I think that's part of the problem. I think South America is better fit with some of the critical minerals, and Asia certainly. And then the refining capacity, which I think that's where we have a big problem and we don't talk about it. And this is not only on manufacturing, this is on pharma, for example. 90% of the active ingredients of medicines, especially generic medicine, which is what the majority of the world consumes, are made in China. So I think Mexico has to become a better partner of the region. This is one of the things that in USMCA, Canada and the US tell Mexico, you're not doing your part on energy. I think we should be a much better player on renewable energies, work together with Texas in terms of gas, for example, which I think is one of the big advantages that we have. And that's it. But I think the best thing, in my opinion, that Mexico can do on the energy market is to really open the market and work together with Canada and the United States. Because I think today, at least, and for the next 10, 15 years, the best thing that Mexico brings into this North American equation is our demographics. We have our largest demographic bonus in the history of Mexico. That means that we've never had so many people willing and able to work, and we will never have more people than what we have today. So for Mexico, I do think that this is a unique window of opportunity to raise the standard of living of all Mexico, not doing everybody nearshoring and not doing everybody manufacturing. I think this is the mistake.
It does raise the issue we've talked about before. I'm not going to go there here, but the whole notion of labor mobility within North America is something that we're going to have to come back to. But Bill, let's stay on topic here and ask you from a hemisphere perspective, are we leveraging the resources that are available to us?
So Latin America is really well positioned for the energy transition, just in general. On the one hand, we have these critical minerals, lithium. Many of the reserves of the world are in Chile, Argentina, I think Bolivia. Copper, going to be incredibly important. But in addition, lots of wind, lots of solar. At this point, Latin America's electricity grid is about 50% green. Okay, that is very green. And in theory, that should be a platform for which, when the Europeans put on the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, the CBAMs, in theory, one could think Latin America could sell itself as, hey, this is a great platform for green manufacturers. And in fact, as they get, I think someone from Siemens is here, Siemens is working with Chile and to develop green hydrogen. If you would imagine you get a green mining sector going and more green manufacturing, that could be a good platform. I think what's very interesting is how committed the region is to developing these alternative sorts of energy and to greening their economies, despite the fact they contribute about 8% of that's not CO2, the broader concept, to the planet. But it is a thing. It's a big thing in the region, and they want to develop it. So it's a question of getting the right partnerships. And again, there is an awareness that they don't want to repeat the kind of pure extractive model of the past, where we can talk, it's a complicated history, but in the end, there was a feeling that they'll come in, taking the copper, that's it, and we get 15 to 20%, whatever, actually sometimes much more. There's a feeling that they want to do sort of what Norway did with its gas and its oil, which is develop a whole set of ancillary industries around it. The kind of thing that Indonesia is doing crudely with nickel is like, okay, export bans, and so you have to develop the secondary processing activities here. I mean, they're just thinking about this, and again, I think we have to think through a way in which we can help with a model where there's more than just extraction. Well, it's a more diversified.
We may have on this stage someone who has a model, who's actually done it. Brian, of course, was Premier of Newfoundland, and you led, in many ways, the transition to make that province, which was a very have-not province, as we referred to it, by leading and seizing the resource revolution, noting that it's a transition, that you're not going renewable tomorrow. Tell us the story of Newfoundland, whether it applies to what Bill just said.
I'd love to chat about that for a moment, but let me just make a couple of points, if I can, first on China, because I think it's really important for us as we think about the green transition to reflect. We all hear today that China has got a grip on all of the essential minerals and metals and so on to facilitate the green transition. I just want to, I'm sure most of us have seen these numbers, but thinking about refining lithium and cobalt, China has a global supply share of 72% and 68% respectively. That was in 2022. That's huge. They've got about 60% of the global manufacturing as a consequence for wind turbines, and about 80% of each stage of the solar panel supply chain, all because they looked out 10, 12, 15 years ago and began the process of accumulating all of the essential ingredients to be a leader and a dominant leader in this field. Now, North America, Europe, we've responded by saying, wow, they've got a grip on things. Bad. We have to find ways to stop that. No, wrong. We can't reverse what's already happened. But we've got to get in the game. And there are still, and as you know, I have a bit of a mining background, there are still lots of raw materials out there. we've got to think not just as private sector players, I'm a private sector guy, we've got to think regionally as well. We've got to think as governments and as a 500 million trading zone about what we need to do to ensure our own security of supply. And the IRA is a giant step in the right direction to achieving that, certainly here in the United States. Canada's starting to wake up and be more assertive as a government in that regard as well. And Mexico is doing its own review as well of public policy. So, we have to get back.
Don't leave that because
You can say that
Emilio's
we're not doing anything. That's okay.
No.
No, Emilio said we have too much groupthink, so I'm going to push back.
Yeah.
You said we have all these minerals, but you know where they are, Brian? They're in the ground.
Yeah.
We are not conducive to investing capital with any predictable, stable regulatory frameworks to know that a 30, 40, 50-year project is viable and reliable because NIMBYism and all kinds of things is getting in our way. What are we going to do about it?
We're gonna have to change the way in which...
Can we?
We can. You can't have a 15, 20-year lead time to talk about hitting the targets that we set for ourselves in terms of the green transition, getting off, reducing carbon, and it takes 15 or 20 years to get a mine built in North America, or for that matter in Mexico, or for that matter in South America. We've got to change the rules. We've got to say that these things are critical, and the process to get to a green light it's got to be responsible, it's got to be thorough, it's got to be proper, but it can't be 12, 15 years of dialogue before we finally get to the point where we can get access to these minerals. You mentioned Newfoundland. I was the Premier of Newfoundland when we had one of the largest nickel deposits in North America, Voisey's Bay. And on that project, we said to the proponent, if you want to build it, great, come on in. You've got shareholders, and I remember saying to them as the Premier, but I got shareholders too, the people of the province. And so you have to do it in the right way, and you've got to put the processing facilities within the province. And one of the great things about that is by insisting upon that, and it was a hell of a fight at the time, today, that facility will not only process nickel out of Voisey Bay, it'll attract nickel from other centers as a processing center and sustain itself on into the future. And of course, nickel's a critical mineral in the green transition. You don't want me to mention being part of making sure that 3 offshore oil and gas projects came to fruition back in the 90s as well. But the same thing. Saying to the players who were there, if these projects are going to happen, they got to happen in the right way. They got to be environmentally responsible. You've got to store and process as much as possible within the region, and you've got to have a plan for end of days, because these things, as we know, have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you can't just walk away and leave a mess behind. So again, quite a fight, public policy fight, but a good outcome, and one that changed the game for Newfoundland and Labrador.
Let's stick with that theme as we wrap up here in the next 14 minutes or so. That is the role of public policy, the role of regulations, the role of trade agreements in terms of the investment decisions that businesses make. And so, Bill, let me ask you about what the impact of the IRA, Brian has certainly referenced it, but the impact of the IRA and the CHIPS Act in terms of regional integration. Do you see this as what I feared, which is the America shoring of things, or can we spread it around in the region?
In principle, I think we should be able to. Costa Rica right now is, I think, ahead of the game. They've been very active in accessing the funds in the IRA. I think that Intel is investing something like $1.6 billion which is a small economy, over the next 2 years, and they've been doing all the necessary stuff in terms of human capital and all to make that an ongoing thing. Dominican Republic is also looking into it. Some of the big countries that it's not as much on the radar as you might think. I think it's on Chile's radar, but not sure how. It's very far away. So I would say that the region is not yet aware to the possibilities of both friendshoring, reshoring, whatever, and how they can interact with U.S. government policies around it.
Emilio, let me pick up on a bit of that in that your political landscape is about to change to some extent. It may be more of the same. Well, how do you see things unfolding in what appears to be a likely outcome of your election from a policy landscape?
I think from the policy landscape, the biggest change I think we will have is on the energy front. and not because they don't want to, assuming that the same political party wins, Claudia Sheinbaum, which is the representative of Morena, the president's political party, who evidently has blocked private investment on energy. I think that's going to change, and it's going to change because socially she's going to get a lot of pressures because we're going to have some power outages in some places. And that seems to be the only way that politicians react, right? So not by conviction, although I think she has a science background, so she understands what we need to do. It's going to take her some time, so she doesn't come into office just saying what my former boss did was all wrong. So I think we're going to have to wait a little bit for that, unfortunately. And I think this is one of the biggest obstacles we have to really make the most out of the opportunity. Other than that, really, even López Obrador has been open to FDI. He has been as open and as, I'm going to say, welcoming of USMCA as the US has been, which has been pretty bad. We have to say that. And I don't think USMCA is working. This is my opinion. And I just use one example. And I don't think it's working because the US is not making it work. The first panel we had as a region was on rules of origin of auto. And Canada and Mexico team up and said, what you, USTR, believe are the rules of origin for automobiles is not what we wrote in the agreement. And we went through the whole institutional process. We have won every single instance. And the USTR still hasn't changed their mind, and they still are not complying to USMCA. So if I was López Obrador, I would say, why do you want me to comply with energy if you don't comply with rules of origin? So I think we have this huge problem where the authorities in this transition looks nice to have USMCA, but really we're not enforcing it. By far, Mexico should have been on a panel, and US and Canada should have won that panel easily 3 years ago on energy, same thing on corn. But it seems to be all about negotiation on the side. Well, if you help me with migration, I'm not going to do anything about energy. And so I think that's my concern. Again, is really taking seriously that we are a region. And I don't disagree with your data. It's your data, so it's
not my data.
You certainly know more than I. But I think one fundamental mistake is that Mexico is still considered Latin America. We have nothing to do with Latin America. Costa Rica, Honduras, they are not the solution because they are so small, so unstable. Not Costa Rica, although they are having their own issues right now. But they are not. The only country that really looks like Mexico today is the United States. There isn't a place where we have more Mexicans living than the United States. The TV that we watch is your TV. I have never watched a show from Brazil or a show from Argentina.
Are you talking about Mexico or Canada now?
Yeah. And my wife is Argentinian, but we have nothing to do with Argentina. She is Argentinian, they are not Mexican. So I think we need to change the whole dynamic of the region and say we are a region. And we need to figure out how we deal with crime, with fentanyl, with organized crime and everything, and trade, which is what, in my opinion, keeps us together with what we call soft power, right? Our food, our people, our culture. When I was looking at the beginning today, a lot of places like Mexico would have an event like this today. So I think there is a lot of hope if we stop being Latin America or Central America or anything else, and we really become North America.
Okay. So before I ask Brian his final question, I want to stick with the theme that you've raised here about the USMCA. So we have a renewal coming up. It feels like we just signed the thing a few days ago, but it's coming up in a matter of a few years here. Brian, for Canada, it's existential. 75 cents of our dollar, I mean, the economy is driven by our trade with the United States. Setting aside whatever happens in November in the United States,
Which is difficult to do.
Yeah, difficult to do, but even hard to guess what's going to happen. So take your pick if you want to weigh in on that. But how do we make sure that we don't put the puck in our own net? I shouldn't use Phoenix hockey analogy. Sorry. Get them back one day. But how do we make sure that doesn't happen?
I thought you were talking about the Toronto.
Oh, yeah. No.
Series. No, look, it's interesting.
Against Boston, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. It's interesting. That's right. I'm living in Toronto, as are you, and our friend Bill is from Boston, so you can tell we're going to be disagreeing tonight as we watch the game. Emilio, it's interesting to hear you say what you've said, and you're right that Canada and Mexico have been frustrated repeatedly in dealing with the U.S. on USMCA. That said, the real question to ask ourselves is, where would we be in the absence of the USMCA? What kind of trading set of rules, what kind of stability would we have to make decisions from? How would capital get deployed if you never knew from one quarter to the next what the rules were going to be? And in the context of November, I think it's a fair comment to say that at least one of the candidates, one could even argue two of the candidates, but certainly one of the candidates is quite capable of making policy on the fly and changing everything in a whim.
But both are protectionist.
And they're both protectionist, and they're both, the only thing they agree upon is China. Everything else they disagree upon. So it is important that the trade agreement is there, imperfect, but fundamentally assuring an ability to do business. And if you look at Mexico, in particular in your sector, the manufacturing sector, in the auto sector, it's not a success story right across the board, but it's been a significant win, I think, for Mexico over the last period of time. So when you ask the question, what do? I think we invest a lot of time reminding people that at a time when the rest of the world is going, I'm exaggerating slightly, going to hell in a handbasket on trade wars, having a 500 million block where we know how to deal with each other, even if we have the occasional disagreement, sometimes significant disagreements, is important. And you know, China's out there with a 10-year plan, always a 10-year plan, and then another 10-year plan, which is why they've got virtual control of critical minerals, because they thought about it. They went off and used the power of the state. They exercised on a plan, and they put themselves in a commanding position. We have to have some of that in our thinking. Private sector has to do its part, but the private sector alone can't determine these large public policy imperatives for the region. Working together, though, we can get there. And in the absence of our working together, trust me, the Chinese are very clever, very farsighted. They'll be in while we're battering each other about the head and about the ears. They'll be in doing the deals that ensure China's in a commanding position and role in the green transition for years to come.
Less than 5 minutes left. See if we can put it all together. This was to be your question. I'm going to come to you last. Instead, I'll go to Bill and Emilio for a quick response to your question, which is effectively, we're seeing industrial policy in vogue again. We're in many countries, we've just lived off good luck. I mean, I say with respect to Canada, we're the country born on third, thinks it hit a triple, right? I mean, it's pretty great to be Canadian, given in the neighborhood we're in and everything that the advantages that we have. But now there's a much more deliberate, intentional approach to economic development, to growing your economy, to growing your industry and your country's GDP. How is that playing out in your hemisphere? What's happening in Mexico? And then Brian, we'll wrap it up with you on the same question. So, Bill.
No, so the big issue is what I was getting at earlier, that we're not growing fast enough. Right? That's even in Chile, which is a country in the region which has most followed all the free market, Washington consensus. Their growth this year is at 2%, and it doesn't look like it's going to be so much better. This is a major, I'll call it ideological crisis in the region, because it's opening up a whole reconsideration of the model that's been in place for 30 years. And at the same time, you've got this whole issue of extractives. You know, they just don't want it to be the way it was in the past. It all goes out, and there's no additional industry, no diversification, no that would give us both resilience to commodity price shocks, but also more growth. And that's not only on extractives, it's also in maquila stuff. You know, it's like you're just exploiting labor. Is there something that's going to come out of this bigger? Are we going to have an iPhone or a Galaxy sometime soon in Mexico? Those are the questions that are on the table, and it naturally leads to what policies do we need for learning written large? How does our economy learn to produce these things? How can we become Canada? How can we become the United States and raise the game so we're not just a source of raw materials? One last thing, because I know I'm taking up all the oxygen. I don't want to go the way Emilio wants us to go. We got to have a whole region. We have to take a regional perspective. First of all, I mean, pure self-interest. We have all the critical minerals are south, and we also have a big interest in keeping this region, friendly. But also there are a lot of opportunities. I mean, a country like Colombia, lots of bad press in the past. There's a whole region of the coffee area which has good education, good infrastructure, good schools. You could offshore there. You could. And there are lots of pockets like this. And you just have to spend the time to find them. And they have to spend more time selling themselves, which they haven't been doing.
Sounds to me like a topic for another panel.
Yes, sorry.
Well done. Well, maybe we'll come to that. Emilio, very quickly on industrial policy.
I think for me, the best industrial policy that Mexico should put in place, and together with the United States, is infrastructure. We've increased 20% exports for the last 3 years, at least. And we have the same roads, we have the same electricity lines, we have the same CBP officers at the border, we have the same bridges to cross from the US to Mexico, we have the same ports, basically. I think that if I would actually take only one thing from the Chinese. I don't want China. I'm super happy in Mexico. I love our country, even with our problems, as you love Canada, but is their infrastructure. I was in Laredo, Texas, about a month ago, and the city of Laredo, Texas just built this beautiful overpass. I don't know how many lanes, and I don't know how many feet in the air. This is the city of Laredo, Texas, that because of trade with Mexico has enough money to build that bridge, saying, how come we don't have this bridge from Nuevo Laredo, Mexico to Nuevo Laredo, Texas? And if you are a trusted trader, which we have the technology to monitor that from Mexico and the US, you just go in this amazing overpass over the border, like we do on an airplane. I'm a global entry registration. I have global entry registration. I don't run off the plane. I take my time. I have 1 hour connections. It's not a problem. I take another line that the rest of the people. I use different technology. They now only take my picture and they let me in. Why shouldn't we have that from companies?
Brian, wrap it up.
Well, just a quick comment, because I can see we're down to the last 20-odd seconds. Canada is stepping up on terms of the spend. So we've put the money up, the government of Canada's put the money up to bring Stellantis in, to bring Honda in, to bring Volkswagen in, battery plants, advanced technology. We've decided we've got to be in the game. We can't be left behind. The IRA has inspired, or if you want, driven, that kind of a response. Today's the first day that a $34 billion pipeline is moving Canadian crude to the coast and off to markets in Asia. And the impact of that is that Canadian oil went up $6 a barrel, because up till now, we're forced to sell it all at a discount only to the United States. So public policy, public expenditures driving different outcomes, securing the future of one's economy is not bad, as long as it's done in a way that's consistent with the rules of the game in the United States, Mexico, Canada trade policy.
So, gentlemen, thank you. Thank you for your insights. I'm going to sum it up by simply saying, at least we need a vision, a long-term vision. We need the capability to execute against that vision. And if there's any takeaway for all of us here, it's the speed with which we need to do that. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panel.